Many people would argue that we've come to a critical time in this interface between humans and the natural world. And they might rightfully argue that the state of the environment is quite poor and things may look bleak. And while I agree mostly with those statements, I'm not here to depress you today. In fact, tell you a little bit of good news and to illustrate that we have made some progress. And so I'll talk to you today about my vision for a prosperous and sustainable world, which involves, of course, a greater understanding, reverence, and respect for nature. Now, there are many ways in which we've begun to incorporate ecological and environmentally sustainable practices into our society, such as through levels associated with industry. For example, using natural biodiversity ecosystem services in agriculture, such as through pollination services or pest reduction, by simply putting habitat out there instead of destroying it, by promoting environments that can sustain native biodiversity. We can work with nature rather than against it. And this is an example in which we can recreate a sort of harmony or equilibrium with nature after centuries of trying to eradicate and control. Another means is to turn to nature for inspiration, such as from this majestic creature, the peregrine falcon, the fastest animal on the planet, who achieves speeds upwards of 300 kilometers an hour as it dives out of the air in order to kick another bird in the back as its prey. Now, any of you who've ever stuck your head out of a car window that's racing down the highway will know how difficult it is to breathe as that air is rushing past your nose. And this would have, of course, been an evolutionary challenge to a fast-traveling bird like the peregrine falcon, and so we find there are adaptations to counter these challenges, such as this little inverted cone that's in its nostril. And so we can also turn to nature in order to inspire ourselves, such as when engineers began building faster and more powerful jet engines. One of the main limitations was being able to get the air to go into the turbine because of all the turbulence that was created at such high speeds. And by inspiring themselves from the peregrine falcon, they were able to insert little cones into the turbines and improve the mechanical efficiency of our technologies. Another way in which we can turn to nature in order to find potential solutions for our problems. And so the last way I'm going to mention, which will really be the body of my talk today, is by referring to nature's inventions directly. That is, in the form of compounds and chemicals that have evolved in nature's organisms over millions of years and have biologically active effects on animals. And so this story I'm going to tell you today is one in which we went down to Peru in 2010 with a film crew for The Nature of Things of CBC television in order to make a documentary on a Vancouver doctor named Dr. Gabor Mate, who you see sitting here in the foreground to your left, who is a doctor who treats Skid Row addict patients of the Lower East Side of Vancouver who are dealing with crippling addictions. So why ayahuasca and addiction? Why would that be even a topic to discuss? Well, we know that in the 1950s, a lot of research was initiated in research institutions and academia looking into psychedelic medicine and its potential roles in treating people with psychoses or various psychological illnesses. And that these experiments and studies led to great promise for treating people that were afflicted with psychological burdens. Of course, this movement was largely discredited over the course of the 60s as people discovered that the military was using psychedelics in order to conduct mind control experiments, and that, of course, the hippie acid parties in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhoods of San Francisco somewhat deviated the seriousness of the potential for these psychedelics to help people. And it's only relatively recently that it's started to come back in the discussions in the halls and the laboratories of academia in using psychedelics to treat people who have psychological disorders. Now, why psychedelics and psychological disorders? Well, psychedelics, be they LSD, the psilocybin of magic mushrooms, DMT, which is the active component in the ayahuasca that I'll be discussing with you today, these are all chemicals that mimic serotonin. And serotonin is a neurotransmitter that acts in our region, the regions of our brains that are associated with mood, perception, and memory. So it's perhaps not surprising then when we overstimulate these receptors with analog mimics of these neurotransmitters, we get these mind-altering experiences. Now, specifically, what's ayahuasca? Ayahuasca is an Amazonian psychedelic brew that is made up of two different plants: the bark from a vine of the Banisteriopsis genus and the leaves of the Psychotria tree. And these two ingredients are harvested and macerated and mixed together and boiled in these cauldrons, boiled and reduced, and then boiled and reduced, and boiled and reduced over 24 hours until at the end you receive this dark, thick, molasses-like sludge. And that is what is used in the ayahuasca ceremonies. And this ayahuasca is the most potent psychedelic that is known. In fact, its effects are so strong that the name itself has some kind of indication towards these effects. Ayahuasca is a Quechuan Amazonian term which literally translates into English as vine of the soul. And so these experiences with ayahuasca clearly give individuals some kind of profound insight into their own psyche. So in order to document these ceremonies and these effects of the psychedelic ayahuasca, we gathered up our film crew and hiked up the mountain outside of Tarapoto, Peru one Saturday afternoon, through thick Amazonian jungle, through stinging fire ant nests and biting bullet ant nests, and across raging rivers. We hiked for hours before we were met at the top of the mountain by our curanderos, or the shamans, at this open-air ceremony hut, or tambo. So we were greeted warmly, and we had time to prepare for the ceremony, which would happen after sundown. And preparation involved partly getting changed into our ceremonial white clothing, which was essential because these rites are performed in complete darkness, in pitch black, and so it's important for the curanderos, or shaman, to be able to see you through the luminescence of your clothing, because they do come over and administer some rites and songs and healing practices. And sometimes they have to prevent some wigged-out space cadets from wandering away from their little trip-out station, which is basically just a little pillow against the wall and a bucket to vomit into. So you see, part of the preparation, of course, is psychological, getting yourself ready for the experience to come. And when it was my turn to go up and get the ayahuasca, said a little salutation, salud a todos, to everyone, wishing us all good luck for what was to come. And what was to come was definitely the most terrifying and the most exciting event of my life to date. So once everybody had received their ayahuasca, they turned out the lights, the curanderos began to sing some ceremonial traditional songs, and not long thereafter, the visual hallucinations began. So the first of these visual hallucinations were that my vision began to be separated into layers away from me. And then in the closest of these layers, I found that they were infested with insects and snakes and bugs all scurrying around, very, very close in my personal space. Many people would have found this to be quite disturbing, but I'm trained as an entomologist, and I therefore focused a little bit more intently on the insects and found that they were mostly carabid and tenebrionid beetles, and so therefore not really much to be concerned about. And so I really did quite enjoy this aspect of the preliminary visuals that were happening. And noticed that in some of the further layers that were more distant away from me, there were actually orbs of pastel-colored lights bobbing around. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's weird, because we're sitting here in the dark. Where does this light come from? And little did I know there would be a lot more light yet to come. One of the other aspects, of course, as I hinted with the bucket, is that there's vomiting at this point. And this is a form of purging in which the body is expelling this nasty, bitter liquid in your stomach. But it's not just the physical purge, it's also a psychological one. Now, it seemed like there was a lot of vomiting going on. In retrospect, there wasn't, because afterwards I looked in the bucket, and there were only a few drops of spit and some torn-up tissue paper that I'd used to wipe my face. But at the time, it really felt like there were these torrents of vomit coming out. And not to disgust you too much, for one, because it wasn't even vomit, it was snakes. So there were snakes oozing out of my nose and my mouth, and this is quite literally what I was experiencing. However, despite this sort of somewhat freaky nature, it was very cathartic because these snakes felt like they were bringing demons up from inside and were cleansing my soul in the process. So in fact, I felt quite good after this purge, good as you can in the experience, and of course it helped me prepare for what was to come next because that was a lot more intense. So not long after, say 45 minutes into this, the first couple of layers of insect grids began to dissipate, and I moved closer towards these bobbing pastel-colored orbs of light and managed to spend a little bit of time in that weird, strange cartoon kind of world until all of a sudden they came rushing at me, and I found myself blasted off into the universe on the back of some kind of fractal fireworks roller coaster. So I was traveling through the universe at light speed, with the visuals becoming much, much more intense at this point, with colorful mandalas of fractals opening and closing and spiraling around each other like clockwork. So quickly I couldn't take it all in. And in fact, at this point, I was also physically being thrown around by the violent turbulence of the wild ride on this comet that I was traveling through the universe on. And again, I had to say to myself, this is so weird. Because rationally, I was able to recognize that there shouldn't be any lights. I'm in the dark in a hut in Peru. And why am I feeling like my body's being thrown around? So this was a really all-encompassing experience at this point. And I have to admit, at this point, it was a little much for me. And I started to panic, thinking, I don't like this anymore. I want to get off. But of course, you can't. You are on this ride until the very end. And at some point, I admitted that to myself and said, well, we're just going to have to ride it out. And so I did. And thankfully, this really intense part of the trip only lasted for, another hour or so. And so that was fun. But when that subsided, we came down into this really thick, quiet, warm, emotionally laden place. It wasn't a room, it was like more of a zone. And this zone was bordered by a big red velvety curtain that reminded me essentially of the Black Lodge in the Twin Peaks television series. But in this hallucination, there were no backwards talking dwarves. However, what did come next was truly astonishing to me. The curtain pulled back and revealed to me a scene, a forgotten scene from my own childhood that was somewhat troubling emotionally. And I had forgotten about that scene probably since the very day it happened, but as soon as that curtain pulled back and I was witness to it again, I recognized it immediately as having been an important event in my life that I somehow had repressed. And what was interesting about this is while I was re-experiencing this slightly traumatic scene from my childhood, I wasn't revisiting any of the emotional trauma associated with it. It was like I was a third-party observer, impartially and objectively being able to watch my life story and to be able to determine why or how it was important to me becoming who I was as an individual. It was almost like I wasn't seeing what was happening, but I was being told why what I was seeing was important to how I became as an individual later on in my life. And so over the course of the next hour or so, these curtains continued to part and presented me with these astonishingly vivid memories that I had forgotten about since those times, but that allowed me to incorporate somewhat troubling experiences from my past objectively into my life story and to be able to move forward without having the emotional burden of those events continue to nag at my conscience and my subconscious throughout the rest of my life. So the point here, folks, is not a story about recreational drug tourism. It's about illustrating the potential for these chemicals to help us heal ourselves, our health, our psychology, and our societies. And to recognize that, let me tell you straight, I had a pretty happy childhood. I was not burdened with a lot of emotional trauma. But even in my experience with ayahuasca, I came out with a profound understanding of the events that led up to me behaving the way I do nowadays. And most importantly, the way I behave when I don't like the way I'm behaving. And usually that those behaviors come from some kind of psychological nagging that is recessed somewhere in the back of your brain that we all carry with us more so those people that have experienced serious traumas and have much more emotional burdens that they carry. And we've already heard from some people here today that have illustrated that they have experienced those emotional traumas and they continue to carry those burdens. Well, ayahuasca is clearly a tool that can be used to allow people to come to grips with those nagging, forgotten memories, to be able to incorporate them into their life story, and then to move on more happy and healthier, psychologically speaking. And therefore, these experiences, as well as the academic research, indicate that there is great potential in the psychedelic medicine to allow people to deal with emotional trauma that has led to behavioral problems, such as addictions, or syndromes such as post-traumatic stress disorder, where people are haunted by their memories and can't let go and move on. So it's very interesting, of course, that these chemicals exist and have that effect. And as an evolutionary ecologist, I don't suggest that they were put here to help us or to inform us. They rather evolved in order to deter the more pervasive insect herbivores. But insects have essentially the similarly structured nervous systems as we do. And whereas these neurotransmitter mimics may cause convulsions and paralysis in the motor system of a simplified animal like an insect, in a more higher evolved animal whose neurotransmitters are clustered into networks, the effects can be profound in terms of giving us insights into our own psyche, of course accompanied with the greatest light show on earth. So the message here is that the potential for turning to nature for help in finding solutions to our problem is great. This potential could be related to working in harmony with nature, such as in the agricultural or other industrial sectors. It could be in terms of turning to nature for inspiration when we're looking to create the next mind-blowing technology, or it could be turning to nature in order to utilize some of the pre-existing structures that have evolved in nature's organisms over millions of years, and that can help us as a society. But of course, nowadays, the environment is in peril. Ecosystems are under threat from human advances and habitat destruction and toxic pollution. And as we lose these ecosystem functions, we don't just lose integral fabrics of our nature, we also lose the potential for these discoveries that can help human society in the future. And so that is why I say that part of my vision for a prosperous and sustainable future involve a deep understanding and respect and preservation of the natural world. And I hope that you would agree.